And then, as I've been talking about, then this goes into feeds into our risk register, and then we develop a risk response plan. And sometimes for smaller projects, your risk response plan will be combined with your risk register. So you'll have a risk register and response plan, because it just doesn't make sense to have too many documents on a small project. You just get inundated with paperwork, and it takes you away from the actual business of undertaking the enterprise, which is the project. So for smaller projects, you'll have a combined document, but for larger projects, you'll have separate documentation. And again, you would go with what's the processes and procedures for your organization. But you would have a separate document for the risk register and a separate document for your risk response or risk management plan. So risk identification, as we've been talking about, needs to go onto the risk register. It happens regularly. It gets updated regularly. You communicate that to all your key stakeholders, so all the key stakeholders are aware of what are the risks and what are the assessments and what are the actions that we're taking for those. And then as I said, for the larger projects, we take out those treatments and we pop that into a response plan, and then that dovetails into our risk register, and then as well as I mentioned earlier, you can complement that, particularly for larger projects, with a risk management plan, which will summarize your whole risk management approach. It will include things such as your project scope and your project plan, and then it will include your risk register, your process for identification, but what you have identified, and then your response component of it. So you'll have all these different variations depending on the size of your project. For a small project, you really just want to have a document that identifies the risk register component, and the response, the treatment component. And it would be an organic document that gets reviewed. For your larger projects, you'll have those documents separated. And then you may also have an overarching risk management plan, which puts it into the context of the project. And the type of thing that you would find within your risk management, the type of components are things like the project title, the approval, version control. You'll have an executive summary, you'll have an introduction, which will basically just give the background information. You'll talk about your risk assessment framework, that is your approach, your mitigation approach, your monitoring approach. You'll talk about the key roles and responsibilities within that. And then you may have appendices. You may have it embedded within the plan or as appendices in the plan, and things like a risk register and your risk response plan. So just to sort of dot our I's and cross our T's, some of the key components to consider in terms of risk management and documentation is just to make sure that you document everything in the risk management process. And that's really, we do that because it's important in terms of gathering data. The more we document, the more objective that the data becomes, and then that gives us better information in which to make decisions. But importantly, it also acts as an accountability mechanism. It demonstrates that we've undertaken due process, we've done the right thing, we've considered those risks, we've properly assessed those risks, and we've properly identified treatments. And then this feeds up to management, so we can then provide management and other decision makers with what our plan is and how we've determined that plan, so we can show how we've assessed the risk and how we've identified treatments for that. And then also that feeds into our body of knowledge that we're going to create at the end of the project. So when we're doing things like our post-implementation review, and we're doing lessons learned, and we're putting together a portfolio that's going to help next time we're in a similar situation, we've also got that documentation that we can include into that as well. So that will go into things such as continuous improvement and review. It creates an audit trail. So if there's ever any questions raised or any issues that are raised from the project, either within the life of the project or after the project, we've got that data there available in terms of the documentation, and that that creates a good solid footprint by which people can see what we've done and how we've done it. And that links back to the issue of accountability I talked about earlier. But also documenting everything makes it just a lot easier to share with all the key stakeholders what we're doing. So as I mentioned earlier, you do your risk response, you do your risk register and your risk response plan. It's easy to consult and communicate when you've got a uniform objective document that we're all talking to the same thing, and it's easier to get everybody on the same page than if you didn't and you were just trying to illustrate that verbally, you run into problems of misunderstanding, miscommunication, and so forth. And importantly, we must also think about accessibility of this documentation. So, where is it kept? How is it kept up to date? How do we archive older versions? So as we're updating our risk response plan, what do we do with the older versions? Where do we store those? How do we put them in? How do we identify them so they don't get mixed up with the newer versions and so forth? If you're working within systems, those things will be already prescribed on how to do it and the steps that you need to go about doing that. But if you're working offline and you're undertaking a small project and you're really managing these documents offline, that's something that you'd need to think about. Okay, how do I share these documents with my team, but also how do I make it clear so that they know where to get it and it's accessible when they need it, so they don't have to run around for a long time trying to chase it up? How do they know that it's the most current version, the up-to-date and current? How can they differentiate the latest version from an older version? Where am I going to store it so that it's safe, and particularly if there's information on there that is either confidential or private? And then how do we back it up so that if anything ever happens, we don't lose that really critical information? So these are the type of things that you also need to consider around documentation. And that's broader project documentation, but specifically in this risk context, there is a greater obligation around demonstrating your duty of care around risk. If you're responsible and accountable for a particular scope of the operation and something goes wrong within that scope under your watch, well, then you're accountable for that and you need to be able to demonstrate you've complied with your duty of care. And documentation is really critical to be able to establish that. So if you've got a good solid footprint in form of the documentation to show that you've undertaken due diligence, well then that's going to be a lot easier to demonstrate than if you didn't.